Hello everyone, welcome back. Me and Willow have got a lot to tell you tonight. First of all, I think tomorrow Willow is going to want a break. I might have another one of my little furry friends here with me. Getting tired of being on TV, Willow? Well, tonight's subject is going to be Star Trek. There's been 4 series made over the last 40 years, I'd say. Of course, everyone mostly remembers the classic original. It was done in the 60s, so that's going to be our focus for tonight. When we start with the original Star Trek, we'll talk about the pilot film first, with Captain Christopher Pike, and the only member who made it to the new series, Mr. Spock. Now, when they made the pilot, they had a lot of actors that didn't make it over to the new series. Like I said, only Spock was the one who did. And some people often wondered why. Well, I'm going to answer a few of those questions tonight. I'll start off with Captain Pike. They didn't feel was tough enough for the role. He was, they felt he had too gentle of an attitude to play a military commander. A few years earlier in the 50s, he played Jesus in King of Kings. So they felt Captain Kirk had more of that tough military-like attitude you might expect in a starship captain. And on the pilot film, Mr. Spock wasn't the first officer. A woman was. But back in the 60s, it just wasn't right to have a woman as second in command. I have times changed since then. So, on the new series, when they started making the series, Spock was the first officer. And the doctor. And they had a different doctor in the pilot film and in first episode with Captain Kirk. Okay, well, see you later. But they didn't bring in Dr. McCoy until actually the 3rd episode. And also in the pilot film, if you might have noticed, the calm and logical Mr. Spock had yet to be born. It wasn't until his first episode with Captain Kirk that they established that Vulcans had no emotions, no feelings, that logic alone dictated their actions. Now, when they finally did bring in Dr. McCoy, part of the idea was, first you had Spock, who was the best, officer you could have. He was obedient, friendly, unemotional. He was the perfect worker, you could say. Then when they brought in Dr. McCoy, they thought to go with somebody who logic alone dictates his actions. They should have somebody who was just the opposite, who was highly emotional, who often let his emotions get the best of him. And as you know, in many of the episodes, Spock and McCoy got into quite a few arguments. Now, one thing you might have noticed in the pilot film, when Captain Pike was talking with one of his officers, the doctor as a matter of fact, the doctor offered him a drink. And then the later episodes with Captain Kirk, often when Kirk went into the sick bay, the first thing McCoy would do was hand him a glass of brandy. Oh, out of the whole series, probably the person who got the most attention, was the most famous, was Mr. Spock. So let's talk a little bit now about his trademarks. For instance, the famous Vulcan neck pinch. In one of the early episodes, Captain Kirk was beaming back up from a planet, and something went wrong with the transporter, splitting him in half. One captain had all the good qualities, and one had all of his bad qualities. Now, there was a scene almost at the end of the episode where the good captain had the bad captain cornered in engineering, and the director originally had it written in the script that Spock would come up from behind and knock him unconscious by striking him over the head with the handle of his phaser. And Spock, or Leonard Nimoy I should say, suggested to the director that there should be a more humane way. After all, this was the 23rd century. And when he asked him what he had in mind, Leonard Nimoy suggested to him that Vulcans could radiate powers from their fingertips, and when placed on a certain point on the shoulder, could render a person unconscious. Excuse me. And they liked the idea, and that was how the Vulcan neck pinch was first invented. Excuse me. Now, probably most famous of all was the Vulcan salute. When Leonard Nimoy was 8 years old, he was raised in a Jewish family, and he would go with his parents to service. And there would come a time when the rabbis up on the stage would ask everyone in the audience to turn their backs to the stage. And Leonard, being a young boy and naturally curious, turned around and looked. And for some reason, the rabbis up on the stage were facing each other, making this sign. Now, whether this is actually some kind of a Jewish sign or just what it means, I actually don't know. Well, he was fascinated by it and practiced real hard till he could do it himself. Now, later, Leonard Nimoy suggested to the director that Vulcans should have a way of greeting each other, just like human beings greet each other with a handshake. And like we say, "How do you do?" They would say, "Live long and prosper." And the director liked the idea. So I believe the first time it was used was when the Enterprise was on a mission to Vulcan, and Spock's parents were beamed aboard the ship. And Spock and his father greeted each other with the Vulcan salute. Now, Dr. McCoy was standing right beside Spock, and he might have noticed he asked Spock how to do the salute. In real life, actually, Leonard Nimoy couldn't. I mean, it's hard to pronounce his name. DeForest Kelly couldn't do it. He got about that far. So that was the beginning of it. And the idea worked really well. I believe in an interview Leonard Nimoy said that the first time he used the Vulcan salute that week, his fan mail grew from hundreds to thousands. Now, over the years, Star Trek has taken on many forms. In the 70s, it became an animated series with the voice of all the original actors, except for one, Mr. Sulu. You always saw Mr. Chekhov and Mr. Sulu driving the ship. But in the cartoon series, for some reason, they didn't have Mr. Chekhov up at the up there driving. They had this creature that he was red with red fur on him. I can't remember what his name was. I couldn't understand why they did that. So he was the only member of the crew. Mr. Chekhov was left out. I read something on the internet about for them to use the actual voice of each character, it costs a lot of money, and they just didn't have enough money in the budget for them to use Mr. Chekhov, so he wasn't part of the cartoon series just because they didn't have the money to bring him in. I think he was quite disappointed about that, but I guess that's showbiz. Now, of course, in the 80s, they came out with a series, Deep Space Nine. The original Star Trek, of course, was about the Starship Enterprise exploring the universe. So they tried a little different approach. Instead of a ship traveling through the universe, they had a space station. And, Captain Sisko, I believe, was the commanding officer. And on Deep Space Nine, they also had characters that they didn't use in the original Star Trek. In fact, when they started making the new series, the first suggestion was that they didn't want to use any of the original Star Trek bad guys from the first Star Trek, and that idea didn't go over too good. So they kept all the originals and just added some new ones, like the Cardassians and the Ferengi and guys like that. Oh wait, I stand corrected. I made a mistake there. Before Deep Space Nine was Next Generation. Deep Space Nine was made in the 90s, and Next Generation was made in the 80s. In Next Generation, of course, they had Captain Jean-Luc Picard commanding the Enterprise. And this was supposedly 78 years later from the time Captain Kirk and his crew were decommissioned. And they ended up finding ways to bring two members of the original series onto the Next Generation just for one episode. They brought back Mr. Scott. Supposedly his ship was caught in on this, what do they call it? It was like a cover that went around a whole star, that gathered up the energy. Well, somehow it had a magnetic force that pulled his ship down, and he put himself in inside the transporter to try to save himself until hopefully someday somebody found him and revived him. And as it turns out, second in command William Riker found Mr. Scott and brought him out of the transporter. So he, 78 years later, he got to ride the second Enterprise. And in one of the 4 Star Trek movies where they used the second Enterprise along with the crew, the new crew, Star Trek Generations, they were able to let Captain Kirk have one more time playing his old role. Everyone just wanted to see Captain Kirk and Captain Picard do something together. Well, eventually, after Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and they ended up making Star Trek Voyager, about a starship that somehow was pulled out of our galaxy and into another one, the Delta Quadrant, I think they called it. And all through the series, there were 7 seasons. They were trying to get back to their home. And, I guess it turns out originally they launched their ship from Deep Space Nine, but some alien force had drugged them into the Alpha Quadrant, or no, into the Delta Quadrant. I get those two mixed up. And so they spent the whole series just trying to get back to their home world. And in the final series of Star Trek, Enterprise, they kind of used the same idea they did with Star Wars. After they made the 3 original episodes, they went back to the very beginning to show how it all started. In this one, it's pretty much the same idea. They went back to when the very first Enterprise was built and launched from Earth, to when the deep exploration mission of space finally began. And the very first captain of the Enterprise was Captain Archer. And they showed that it was from the Vulcans that we first got our ability to travel into space. In fact, on which one was it? One of the Star Trek movies with Captain Picard. I think it was First Contact. They showed in the end of the movie how we first came in contact with the Vulcans. Gee, we were lucky. The first aliens we met were peaceful, civilized people. Imagine if our first encounter would have been with the Klingons. So the great commanders of Star Trek were Captain James T. Kirk, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Captain Benjamin Sisko, Captain Catherine Janeway, and Captain Archer. When they started making Star Trek movies, the original were, of course, all with the original series with Captain Kirk. And I'm going to tell you, some people don't know part of the reason the Star Trek movies were actually made in the first place was because in the mid-70s they were going to make another Star Trek series with Captain Kirk and the original cast. And they had actually filmed 5 episodes with those. But then, this was right in, I think it was 77 when Star Wars had just come out. They thought the best way to compete with the competition was to make Star Trek the motion picture. So that's how the Star Trek movies got started. And I guess that went, they had 1, 2, 3. Oh, actually, let me show you. I ended up buying all the original Star Trek movies. I think they come in this big case, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 movies in yes. There were 6 original movies with the original cast. When they made Next Generation, when they made Star Trek Generations, that was the first time they kind of showed the old with the new. In the beginning of the movie, they brought back Captain Kirk and Mr. Chekhov and Scotty. They were being given a tour of the new Enterprise. Then they cut from there and they went 78 years later to where Captain Picard was the captain of the Enterprise. But originally, with the episodes that just involved Captain Kirk, there were 7 of them, 7 movies to be precise. And then eventually they made 4 movies with Captain Picard. I think those movies, let's see, it was Generations, First Contact, Insurrection, and Nemesis. And, the original movies with Captain Kirk were the motion picture, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and actually Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. That was the final ones with Captain Kirk. Oh, and there was one more. Star Trek, The Captain's Summit. Actually, this wasn't in the theaters. Basically, let me show you here. There was a rare interview where Captain Kirk and Captain Picard and First Officer Spock and First Officer Riker were all able to just sit down and discuss the history of Star Trek. Very interesting. Well, I guess that's it for tonight. Tomorrow, as I said, I'll have another one of my furry friends with me. So for now, I'm just going to let you go and live long and prosper.